You people don't look quite as scary as you did in my imagination earlier on. This hall and this place has quite a lot of memories for me, because I was brought up just, I don't know, about half a mile from here. And this is where I learned to swim, just through the way there. They've moved where the pool is now. We used to call it the swimming baths, which those of a certain age will remember. And I learned to swim there. I think this very hall was the hall where my mother, when I was very wee, we all came here. There was a mass X-ray campaign to discover which of us had TB. And it was dark and it was dingy, but I'm sure it was in this hall. It's also where I learned about sectarianism, at the sharp end of sectarianism, not quite in the hall, but on the way here. I was coming through the Wynford estate with my very best friend Joseph. Trunks rolled inside my towel, and we're walking through there. They were just building the Wynford estate then. And 3 boys on bikes approached us. They didn't look friendly, and one of them became the spokesman and the interrogator. So he said, as he looked at it, he said, "Okay, boys, what team do you support?" I've been well schooled in this by my mother, so you knew the safe answer, which was Partick Thistle. The sad truth is it was also the true answer. You think, I'm off the hook, I'm okay. But this guy was Taliban-like, and he said, what school do you go to? At this point, my very best friend, my very, very, very best friend, Joseph, took over. I go to St. Charles, he said. He goes to Shakespeare. And it was at this point that I discovered that a scared Protestant can outrun a Catholic on a bike. It's a lesson well learned. I've been given the job today to talk about Ephesians. It came up, well done. It's a huge big passage, and all the stuff I've done is, I read it in a number of versions, but I'm sticking with the Message version because it kind of talks the language that I talk. So bear with me on that. And the idea is we have to talk about how we've to live as Christians. That's the title, to live. It's going to look at how we deal with our obsessions as Christians, our perversions, I use the word advisedly, how to use our voices, how do we speak, about gossiping and swearing, and about using cheap religious talk, meaningless religious talk, and also about how to do our relationships, how to be a better husband or wife or father or mother, parent, child, or boss, or employee. And that's the job I've been given. Yippee. Let me pause for a second, because I'm always struck by the fact that when you stand in front of any group of people, church people no less, you have to remember who you might be talking to. And because all is not as it seems, is it? I'm gazing at faces, and it's really important to do that, I think. I heard about a minister once who stood up to speak, had his notes neatly in front of him in the lectern, and he made the mistake of looking at his people before he started speaking. And he saw there a range of people. He saw a woman who he knew was having an affair with her boss and was on the verge of leaving her husband to go with this guy. He saw a woman, a family, and one of the church leaders, one of the men who was a church leader. And he knew that this guy was terribly neglecting his family because he was, as he put it, about the Lord's work. And he saw a guy shuffling at the back, hoping nobody comes in at the minute, shoulders down, head hunched, and sat in the back row. And he knew this guy well, and he realised that this is someone who was deeply depressed and he felt was on the verge of, well, thinking about suicide. And he looked at these people and he looked at his notes and he tried to see where's the match. And I think that's important for us always to do when we come in together. That's what we come to, because we're people the same as everyone else. So let's remind ourselves of that as we start. I don't know where most of your lives are right now, but I'm going to work on the assumption that your lives are at least as complicated as mine. Right, that said, I'm going to suggest that you take this passage home and read it yourself, because it's massive. And I didn't want to take so much of my valuable time reading the Bible to you. That was a joke, in case you weren't sure. I'd be interested to know if anybody does do this, because I think most of us don't do that. When somebody says to you, go home and read this, you kind of think, okay, I'll do that, but you don't. But if you did, I'd be interested to know if you felt as despondent after you'd read it as I did. Because I kind of felt that by this late stage of my life, I'd be much more on top of my game. As I read each section here through these verses, I just felt more and more despondent. There were questions kept coming up to me. And I thought, after, when Paul says, take on an entirely new way of life, he says that at the beginning in chapter 4. After around 50 years of doing this stuff, I asked myself the question as I went through it, is my thought life better now than it was when I was in my 20s? Do I gossip less? Do I swear less? Says it fast. Do I still trot out trite, meaningless, religious sayings? Am I a better husband than I once was? Am I a better father? Was I a good employee? I used to have a job. Was I a good employee? Was I a good boss? And all these questions kept coming as I was reading through this. And I thought, that voice, that must try harder voice that we all hear, well, certainly I hear, I'm guessing many of you do as well, it just was really powerful. But that can't be right, surely that can't be right. That sounds too, no wonder you're despondent after that. If we read chapter 4, verse 24, the full verse says this: take on an entirely new way of life, a God-fashioned life, a life renewed from the inside and working itself into your conduct as God accurately reproduces his character in you. A life renewed from the inside and working itself into your conduct. I have a couple of quotes that I'd like to pass on to you, because there are people who say things better than you can. The first one's an old dead French priest. Most of the people I read now are dead and old, and but said good things. This guy's called Pierre, forgive the French, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, which you'll have probably heard of, some of you. And he says this: above all, trust in the slow work of God. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Good, it's there. I really, that's a piece, just a small paragraph that I find really helpful. That anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Most of us know that. And here's a wee quote from just a lovely book. It's a Graham Greene book, Monsignor Quixote. And it's an old priest. If you know the book, there's an old priest in it. And he's a lovely old guy, and he's close to dying. And he's kind of reflecting on his life. And he says this: am I in a good or a bad state? Has God pardoned me? I at once reply, God wishes to conceal all that from me, so that I may blindly abandon myself to his mercies. I do not wish to know what he does not wish to show me, and I wish to proceed in the midst of whatever darkness he may plunge me into. It is his business to know the state of my progress, mine to occupy myself with him alone. He will take care of the rest. I leave it to him. Yeah, I leave it to him. Some of you might have noticed that the Catholics finally caught up with me. That's the first thing I'd like to just leave you with, that this is something that happens on the inside. And we maybe, in some of our discussions with each other, we forget about the mystery of what's going on inside us. And I think it's important that we remind ourselves often of that it's a work to change us that's going on. It might be slow, but it's going on inside us, and it's God's work. I think, as some of you are probably thinking, yeah, that's fine, Iain, but Paul is also saying here, you need to work out what has been done within you. And it says in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, this about working out in practice what we do. How do we do that? And it says there, watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. That's a really powerful verse. I love that verse. I think it's really good. But it begs a question. How do we learn about keeping? How do we keep company with God? That's what I want to ask you today. I'd like you to really exercise your minds on that. What does that mean? I kind of think often when it comes to times like this in churches, we kind of revert to the kind of, I don't want to say cheap, meaningless religious talk, but that's the phrase that's in my mind. We use phrases that we've used again and again and again and again and again, and eventually they become meaningless to us. And so when I ask the question, how do we keep company with God? What does that mean? So I asked a few friends, and some of these friends are here, and some of them are elsewhere. And I said, so what does it mean to you to keep company with God? And they came up with a range of answers, as you would expect. Some of them spoke about reading the Bible. Some spoke about praying. I have to look at the list because there's a long list here. Some of them spoke about a contemplative regime that seemed to go on happily for hours. Retired people, presumably. Others talked, and I quote, snatching 10 minutes before a hectic day. Some spoke about music and books and art and nature and journaling and walking and guruk and friends, and some just sitting thinking, keeping company with God. I also asked a very good friend of mine, a Sikh woman, Jaswinder, and her answer knocked my socks off. She thought about this. But what struck me most in all these diverse answers was that you people, the ones who answered here, were looking to keep company with God. That was what they wanted to do. And I guess a question I'd like to leave you with is, have you found your way? It might not be the traditional way that we've been taught. Read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, grow, grow. I don't mean to be sacrilegious, but that can be expanded into all kinds of different ways, and some of them have been mentioned there. Have you found your way to keep company with God? I like what I read recently, and if you don't mind me, I'll just read this other wee quote that I came across. Clear your mind just for a minute. Stop the wheels and listen with your soul. Within the silence, you'll find a simple and ancient truth that God waits for us in the quiet valleys of life, softly singing to us, patiently waiting for us to sit quietly and listen to the truth that he wants us to hear. He doesn't flaunt himself on the dance floor of our life when the music is loud and the lights are bright. Instead, he waits for those quiet interludes when we are listening carefully. Then, with a whisper and a nudge, he pours his light and harmony across our lives, asking us to hear and see. So when we keep company with God, what does he say to us? Well, he says, and Douglas has kind of touched on it, learn a life of love, he says in that verse there. And we need to notice that when it talks about Jesus giving love, he doesn't give love in order to get something back. He doesn't want something from us. He wants us to receive him. That's his aim. And that's another thing I think for us to take away and mull over. Can you imagine relationships like that in our lives? Because that's what we're called to. A love for my wife that's not cautious but extravagant, which doesn't demand anything back from her, but it's about giving everything of myself to her. Can you think of relationships, the relationships in your experience? Your partner, your child, your employees, anything, friends. Supposing you didn't seek anything from them in your relationship with them, but purely you're there to give to them. I wonder if you're feeling despondent again. You know, that kind of feels like a heavy ask, doesn't it? A big thing to say to us. Everything of yourself to someone else. But let's remember, our lives, the lives that we have, are God-fashioned, renewed from the inside out as God reproduces his character in us. It's his work in us. I've already seen hints of this in those of you who I know a bit better than others, that there is this self-giving. I think we're called to that, and we're called to just be with God, keep company with him in ways that we find appropriate. And I'm running out of words to say here. I'm going to stop, and thanks for listening. I used to be a teacher, and this used to be a doddle, I have to tell you.